God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful. Oh God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful. At thy feet, oh, I do bow. At thy feet, oh, I do bow. Oh God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful. Oh God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful. In the forest thou art green. In the forest thou art green. In the mountain thou art high. In the mountain thou art high. In the river thou art restless. In the river thou art restless. In the ocean thou art grave. In the ocean thou art grave. O God, beautiful, O God, beautiful. O God, beautiful, O God, beautiful. At thy feet, oh, I do bow. At thy feet, oh, I do bow. O God, beautiful, O God, beautiful. O God, beautiful, O God.
Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, beloved God, Great Masters, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Shri Yukteswar, beloved Guru, Paramahansa Yogananda Ji, Saints of all religions, humbly bow to you all. Bless us with the tools and the desire to look within and find our own fulfillment, residing in the deepest parts of our consciousness and of thy creation. Om. Peace. Amen.
My name is Narayan, and on behalf of my wife, Devi, and I want to welcome all of you to our special program this evening, the Life of Yogananda. It's a sincere joy and privilege to introduce to you our panel. I think most of you know them, but for some new people perhaps, and some of us joining online may not. Nayaswamis, Jyotish, and Devi are the spiritual directors of Ananda worldwide. And Swami Kriyananda, who is a direct disciple of Yogananda, asked Jyotish to be his spiritual successor. And together, Jyotish and Devi travel around the world as dynamic emissaries of Yogananda. Master said to follow the living link of the masters and of the path of self-realization. And speaking personally, Jyotish and Devi are very live wire and link to our line of gurus. And it's a great joy that they've come to Southern California to share with us, not only at the Yogananda Festival, but tonight and at our programs this weekend. So we're deeply grateful to have you both with us and sharing with us. And we have their book, Touch of Joy, as well, and there'll be a book signing afterwards with them. And Phil's book, which is in my bag. Phil Goldberg, who I was talking with Lori. I just met Lori, Phil's wife, but I realized that I had met Phil about 10 years ago. Phil may not remember, at Ananda Village. When he was coming up, he does. And he was doing research for American Veda, which is one of his incredible books on how the Vedic culture has, in a certain way, conquered inwardly our Western land. And this new book that he has written, The Life of Yogananda, is a real masterpiece. It gives you context and understanding of Yogananda's journey as a human being. We all, I think, know the extraordinary soul that Yogananda was, but to really appreciate the challenges that he faced of coming to America some 100 years ago and going through all of the struggles to start a spiritual organization, spiritual work. And after reading this book, it gave me even deeper appreciation for my guru, for Yogananda, and deeper appreciation for Phil, and gratitude for his friendship on the path. So it's with great privilege that we warmly welcome Phil and Jyotish and Devi this evening for the Life of Yogananda. Please. Just so you're aware, the format will be Phil will share briefly, Jyotish and Devi will share briefly, and then we want to have time for a dialogue, for questions and answers. So please, if you have questions, just store them away, and we will have time to explore them together.
Shall I?
Yes.
Well, thank you, Ryan. It's an honor to be here. I always enjoy being in Ananda settings, and especially wonderful to share a platform twice in 1 week with my friends Jyotish and Devi. One of the things that happens when you write a biography is you find out colorful little facts. So I'm going to share with you that the song that opened the evening, in 1927, Yogananda was booked to give a talk at Carnegie Hall in New York. The place was packed. He chose to sing that song for almost an hour and a half. It was a really mind-blowing event, but he felt Carnegie Hall was meant for music, and people tried to talk him out of it, and he said, no, music is a universal spiritual language, people will get it. And he did it. Let me begin by addressing the proverbial elephant that follows me wherever I go these days, which is the question, how can you have the temerity to write a biography of a great human being who is known all over the world for his autobiography? I know some of you were thinking that. And there are a few answers, and I'll try to be brief. One is that I'm paying off the karma by having borrowed Autobiography of a Yogi in 1970 and never returned it. I never became a formal student of Yogananda's or a disciple. I had my own path. And, but I always admired him, always learned from him over the subsequent years. And when I was researching American Veda, the book Narayan just mentioned, I had to write about all the gurus who came to the West. And he stood out, of course, as, if not the most influential, certainly he's tied for the lead. And I also became fascinated by his personal life, by the human story of Yogananda, about which we know more than we do about the personal lives of most renunciates, most gurus. Very few of them speak about their lives prior to having taken vows as swamis or brahmacharis. But he did, and others spoke of his life. And I became fascinated with it, but I only had one short chapter to devote to it. And so after the book had been out a while, and I thought of what else I want to do next, the idea came to me to write a full-on objective biography from birth to death, as we say in the trade. And to my surprise, no one else had done that. There were memoirs Kriyananda had written about the memories of being with his guru, and others, direct disciples, did. But they were not real biographies. They were more like tributes and memoirs. And then I reread an Autobiography of a Yogi and realized how much he left out. I'm sure most of you have read it, and you'll remember that a lot of the book is about people other than himself. And there's a reason for that. He set out to write a book early on called The Yogi Christs of India. And he started gathering these portraits of great saints and yogis. And then somehow the book morphed into a combination of that and his own memoir, his own autobiography. But he leaves out a lot. And he leaves out especially his life here in America. He came here in 1920. He was only 27. Except for the 16 months he was in Europe and India in 1935 and 6, he lived the rest of his life here. And by here, I mean here in LA mostly, in Southern California. And was all over America, especially in the 20s and 30s. He was quite the itinerant monk, filling up large auditoriums and all over the country, and building his organization. So we know of Yogananda, and we admire Yogananda and revere Yogananda because of the work he did here in those last 32 years of his life, and yet less than 10% of his autobiography is about that. There are big gaps of time. So my job was to fill the gaps. And I'm convinced that everybody who reads it will learn something new. And to give it historical context. His childhood in India, the years he was here, and through the Roaring '20s and the Depression and World War II, to give it historical context that he himself couldn't do without the benefit of hindsight all these years later. So that's why. So don't complain. And the other thing I want to emphasize at the beginning here, I don't want to go through the facts of his life, but it was a compelling human story. I set out to write the story of a human being. Many people feel Yogananda was an avatar, an incarnation of God. Others feel he was just, he was a highly realized yogi and a great master teacher. Whatever your understanding of Yogananda's spiritual status or cosmic status, he was still a human being, living a human life. And the story of how Mukunda Lal Ghosh, born in 1893, grew up to become Paramahansa Yogananda was intriguing to me. That's a human story. He had parents. He had a background. He lived in different cities. He spent his formative teenage years in Calcutta, which was sort of like the New York City of India at that time. And the neighborhood he was in was kind of like Greenwich Village. These things shaped him. He was in the shadow of the great Swami Vivekananda and Ramakrishna. All these things affected his life and who he became, and I got intrigued by that. And some of the things I discovered, it was fascinating to discover the teenage Yogananda, who was a natural leader, but other natural leaders would be, organizing soccer games and parties and mischief, and he was organizing satsangs and starting a little ashram when he was 15. And taking his friends to meet swamis and gurus and go to temples and all that. He was marked for the role he was to play. And then he was shaped by the experience and by his guru. And all that was fascinating. Even more fascinating to me, because he hadn't written much about it, and no one else had, was his life here in America and how he adapted to life here and what it was like and what he endured. And the biggest surprise to me was how challenging it was and the difficulties he had to face. Not just personally, because he was a stranger in a strange land, and a dark-skinned, long-haired one at that in the 1920s and 30s when, traveling looking like that could be hazardous to one's health. And he faced, the dark side of America. He faced racism and religious bigotry and all kinds of stuff. He endured lawsuits. He endured what he called betrayals by people. He had money problems. He was building an organization, and he did not want to be a CEO, but he did. He had to deal with things that everyday entrepreneurs have to deal with, paying the bills and dealing with managing human beings who could be problems. All those things he was fairly candid about in some of his commentary and his private letters. And he always had this little push and pull that he had from childhood on of enjoying the world and then later of having this great mission that was given to him by his guru lineage, and having the commitment to fulfilling that mission of bringing Vedic knowledge to the West and doing it well and doing it with dignity and integrity. And at the same time, he's always had the impulse he had from childhood, which was he just wanted to go into seclusion and be close to God and be a monk. And the lure of the Himalayas, the lure of the Ganges, was always with him. And when things got tough, he was tempted to give it up and go back to India. But he never did. And that persistence and will to live his dharma and do it well was really intriguing to me and deeply inspiring. And a reminder that no matter what our spiritual path may be, and no matter how advanced we are or think we are, we still have human lives. And the stuff of human lives will come to us. We'll get backaches. We'll get sick. People will die. People will, try to cheat us. We'll lose money and gain money. All these things. And the promise of the yogic life of having permanent peace and bliss eventually, and full awareness of the divine nature of the self, all that is real. And we all can sense growing toward that. And in Yogananda's case, you see the moments in his life when he came to fully realize those aspirations. And he wrote about that with great eloquence. But he still had a human life, and he had to deal with it. And he was concerned about those things. And I found that tremendously inspiring and instructive. And it makes me think, stop complaining. If Yogananda could deal with that, you deal with it too. Just come back to your inner divine nature. Because he would never forget, and didn't let any of his followers forget, that while they have to do their work and while they have to do their duty, the principal task was self-realization. And that was the foundation of everything else, including doing the job well. You see that in his life. There are lessons to be learned from that life. It's not just an interesting life, not just a unique tale of an extraordinary person, but it's an instructive life. It's one we can take away lessons to apply to our own lives. Next.
I'll say that Phil, I read the book first in manuscript form because Phil wanted us to comment, make sure that from our viewpoint the facts were correct, which he had many, many more facts than we did, but also that Yogananda was treated with proper respect, even though Phil had to be the historian in telling Yogananda's tale. So we read it first in the manuscript form and then have read, subsequent iterations. And I am very deeply thankful to Phil for what he's done for me personally, but in a sense more so for what he's done for everybody in terms of the life and story of Yogananda. I read the autobiography more than 50 years ago. I read it in 1966. And I don't know whether I didn't return it or what the karma was, but that book absolutely changed my life. And my life from that time on, or very shortly after reading it, 2 or 3 months after reading it, I met Swami Kriyananda, who, as Phil said, had been a direct disciple of Yogananda. So I became connected with Swami Kriyananda and Yogananda, and that became my life. So, for 50 years, I've heard stories of Master. I've read the Autobiography of a Yogi countless times, and we always laugh because every time you read that book, somebody has inserted a new chapter in it that you didn't read before, or a new language, because it's like Yogananda talked about in a beautiful poem, the spiral staircase of life. You keep returning, but never at the same level on which you went through that same circle before. Reminds me of just a slight diversion. Some years ago, we gave a course on Patanjali, a week-long course. We had a man who was had a good sense of humor, and at the end of the course, we were sharing what we gained from the course and kind of a wrap-up session, as one often does in these kinds of things. And this fellow said, I'm still confused, but at a much higher level. And so the life of Yogananda, I have circled around and around and around in this spiral staircase and touched on it. But I've circled within, and most people have until this book came out, we've circled within a certain kind of a universe. There have only been a certain number of facts and a certain number of anecdotes and a certain number of stories. And so there's just been, the universe of knowledge about Yogananda was relatively contained. Yogananda didn't talk about himself very much. And his autobiography didn't explain that, nor did anyone else. Swami Kriyananda did basically the same thing that Yogananda did when he wrote his autobiography, The New Path. He took his life as he was growing up. Then the major section of the book is meeting Yogananda and the 3.5 years with which he was with Yogananda, which ended in 1952. And then that's it. He doesn't talk about the rest of his life in that path, in his autobiography either. So those biographies kind of end without the story being completed. Well, Phil comes along and he fills in not only a lot of facts, but for me, as he was saying, I could see the arc of the human life of Yogananda and the struggles that he went through and the rhythms that he went through. I kind of had the vague impression that Yogananda came to America and spent a couple of weeks doing something and then filled up Carnegie Hall. Well, it wasn't that way at all. There was a lot of struggle and a slow growth until he was able to do that. But you get a lot of that sense of the rhythm and sense of the struggle and sense of the human drama from Phil's book. And the other thing that is really important is that with these great saints, great souls like Yogananda, they get put up on a pedestal And as time goes on, that pedestal kind of gets cranked up by the passage of time until it gets higher and higher, and then it doesn't seem like they're really quite human. And so, yes, sure, they can say, you know, be honest or be happy or life is a struggle for joy, and there are thousands of beautiful statements by Yogananda. But there's the tendency to say, well, yeah, but he didn't have a life like the rest of us. And Phil brings that pedestal back down to a human level and lets us see that even at the greatness of someone like Yogananda, he still has to go through that human drama, the same human drama that you and I go through. Now, for us, because our connection has been less historical and more on a spiritual level, for us, the traversing of that human drama is more dependent on the spiritual consciousness and the attitudes and the practices and the way to approach life. You know, part of our teachings is that we have transited out of Kali Yuga, which is the age of form and things are I compare that to water, which has been frozen solid. And so you've got ice, you can cut it into blocks and you can move those blocks around and they stay where you put them and so on. Now we've moved into the age of energy and that water has melted. So in Kali Yuga, or in, let's say, 1,000 years ago, the rules of life were relatively simple or relatively complete. You know, most people grew up, they never traveled more than 20 miles from where they were born. So they knew the terrain, they knew the people, they knew the rules. Everybody had their place in society. It's like the roadmap for Kali Yuga is very different from the roadmap for Dwapara Yuga. A map that works on land is no good whatsoever at sea. And so so when that ice melts, now in our time we're at sea. And that old roadmap doesn't really quite work. And so at sea you can't have a map, you need a compass. Now you can have a map of coastlines and so on, but you need a compass to maneuver around in the sea. And what Yogananda brought was the compass, which were the moral teachings or the spiritual teachings by which we change ourselves, and that gives us the direction to maneuver through, because we're all, Yogananda of course was more so, but we're all strangers in a strange land. We're all in a time, there's never been a time like now. Well, that could be said at any time. There's, you know, as we go through time, we're always at the edge of the unknown. And how do you maneuver through the unknown when a roadmap isn't any good anymore? Well, Yogananda gave us a map for Dwapara Yuga, but that map is not one that's external, it's internal, it's a compass. And his first book, I've mentioned a couple of times, was the basic theme was that everybody in the world is looking for happiness and trying to avoid pain. That's the basic motivation for everything that people do. Well, that's not a new thought. You know, that's been a thought in philosophy all along. I just read today something I hadn't known, that Aristotle talked about that same theme, that man's purpose is to find happiness. And interestingly, he said that a virtue is that which draws us closer to happiness, and a vice is that which draws us away. That's a very yogic thought, because it isn't a virtue is fixed. A virtue is that which for you will make you happier. And so what Yogananda came to do in a spiritual sense was, one, to give us a sense of what those virtues are. How can we be happy? And it isn't outside of ourselves. It isn't with fixed rules. It isn't with a roadmap. He said you've got to go within yourself. You've got to calm your mind. He taught meditation. That's primarily what he did, was the teaching of meditation, and then the attitudes or the virtues by which to live to help each of us become happier, more fulfilled individuals. And that quest, that directional quest, has no end. It ends, as he said, in endlessness. It ends when we finally achieve the breakthrough from the sense of being confined in a separate ego, or the soul identified with this single body and this personality, when we get to a high state of consciousness where we become united with everything, which is yoga. That's the meaning of yoga, is that union that takes place. So his primary thrust was to teach the virtues of self-realization. But as I say, it is very interesting to see that he had to go through a very difficult human drama, and he had to walk the talk of what he was talking about. He had to find his own joy in the midst of a lawsuit, in the midst of prejudice, in the midst of financial difficulties. So difficult that, as he said, they were eating tomatoes from the hillside at Mount Washington, just down the road. So it's that combination of the human drama which we all have to live, and they come as examples, they come as models for us. So the combination of the human drama with the divine search and the divine attitudes that makes his life story so powerful. And so I would say that if you haven't done it, get the autobiography in one hand and Phil's book in the other hand, and read sequentially through that.
I'm going to stand up because I am stature challenged and I can't see the people that are here. So, well, I think I'll just start by thanking Phil for what he has offered. I became a disciple of Yoganandaji in 1969 and have followed him for all of my adult life. And when he told us he was going to write the book, we knew Phil. We were good friends with him from American Veda, one could say. But I trusted him. I trusted his integrity. But I thought, Yogananda has been the pole star of my life. He's something very precious to me, an inner guide, something that I have formed my life around. And although I trusted Phil, I thought, oh, I hope he gets it right. And how delighted I was when we read it. And I thought, he got it right. He got it right in the sense that writing in a journalistic, historical style of a historian, he still brought respect, reverence, appreciation, and actually a lot of devotion to that book. So I think he has brought a great contribution to the world of not only spiritual literature and spiritual biographies, but to the times in which we live, where there is so little that you can use as a moral compass, as a guideline to how to proceed. There was another great spiritual teacher who lived some years ago, and he had 4 main biographers. They were, I think we all know them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And yet their accounts are very subjective, aren't they? They're different according to who they were, according to how they saw the master. And one of my favorite lines in the Bible was at the very end, I think it's the last sentence or 2 of John. where he says, I suppose if all the stories would be written down, they would fill volumes. And that's the life of a master. It's impossible to put him in a box. It's impossible to fully capture him. Many direct disciples, Swami Kriyananda being one, and others have written accounts of their time with Yogananda. But a spiritual master is like a beautiful diamond. It reflects light from many, many different angles, depending on what your perspective is. And that's the challenge of trying to really capture the life of a spiritual master. But I think what I'm so grateful to Phil about is that he brings a very important piece. He places in place a piece of the puzzle. Who is this man? What was the significance of his life? What impacted, what did he go through? What did he learn from that? How did that inform how he presented the teachings of the ancient masters of yoga of India to the West and by extension to the world? And this is something important to understand because Jyotish and I spend a lot of time teaching in India, where Ananda has established quite a broad-based work there. And when we first started teaching, Swami Kriyananda, our founder and our teacher, was still alive, and he said, okay, go and you can, teach masters' teachings. And speaking personally, I was totally intimidated. How can I go and teach yoga to Indians, and we kind of said, Swami, we feel a little bit ill-equipped to do this, even though we've been teaching it for decades in the West. And he said, don't think of yourself as a Westerner or an American. Think of yourself as a disciple of Yogananda. That's what these people are not. Whatever their culture is, they're not yet disciples of Yogananda, and that's what you can share. And I thought, oh yes, I can do that. But the beautiful thing that happened as we began teaching in many, many cities in India, Delhi and Bangalore and Chennai and Mumbai and Pune and cities I never heard of, Coimbatore, and was that people, the Indians, were hungry for a new approach to yoga. They were hungry for the yoga that was brought from the West, from India, brought to the West, and then internalized and reconfigured according to the Western mentality and life experience. And then when we brought that back to India, it was like people were saying, one woman said so beautifully, she said, I was an Indian friend in Delhi, she said, I was raised with the Bhagavad Gita. I grew up with it. But it was like it was a sacred deity on a pedestal that we poured yogurt over and worshiped. When I read Yogananda's commentaries on the Gita, for the first time, I understood what the Gita was. And so it was just fascinating for us. And weaving together what Phil and Jyotish have been saying, we need to understand how Yogananda, what his experience was in the West, to appreciate more how he re-expressed, not changed at all, but re-expressed Western, or the teachings of yoga to the Western mind. And now when we bring that, another friend of ours said, at first when I saw all you Westerners were teaching meditation and yoga, I kind of laughed. But then, and this was a woman educated in the West, she said, but then when I saw what you did, and it's just what Master did, you systematized meditation. You systematized the path to God. You systematized self-realization in a way, you broke it down into logical steps. Master learned that from all of his experiences in the West. And then when you bring it back, it's like people say, we've been waiting for this, we've been waiting. And Master predicted that a new age would come when the practicality of the West, and for practical efficiency, would be blended with the spiritual depth and understanding of India. He said when those two forces come together, it will help usher the world into a new age, into a higher age. And so what Phil's book does is it helps us to understand how Yogananda got there. When Master went back to India to visit his guru in 1935 and 36, Sri Yukteswar, his guru, who was a little bit, he was, for those of you who don't know, he's the middle picture there, looking at you, kind of like you forgot to lock the car. There's a little
He's right behind you.
He's a little bit like, you know, you really don't have your trip together. But so Master went back and visited his guru, first time he'd seen him in 15 years, because he left in 1920 for the West. And Sri Yukteswar said, I'm a little concerned that you're changing the teachings that I have taught you to reach people in the West. And Master had a wonderful answer. He said to his guru, sir, you are like the goldsmith. You work in pure gold. I am like the jeweler. I fashion the gold so that people can wear it. Mm. And when he said that, Sri Yukteswar said, I understand, and you have my blessings. And so that's what Yogananda did. And we understand how and why he did it from the episodes in Phil's book. He took the gold that this great lineage gave him, he fashioned it so that we can use it. And as we said, the challenge of really understanding a master, to, you know, in all truth, you have to be one to know one. But still, we can try to understand with our hearts and with our minds, who is this master? Who is he? But there's a story, and I'll end with this, and then if you have questions, we'll have Phil answer them, because he knows a lot more about it. But there's a story of the 7 blind men and the elephant. And it's, you know, it's a metaphor. But there are these 7 blind brothers wandering along the roads of India, and they encounter an elephant. And they say, brothers, what is this? What is this wonderful creature? And one of them feels the side of the elephant, the flank, and he said, oh, the elephant is like a big wall. And then the other one said, no, no, no. And this one's been holding the tail. He said, no, no, the elephant is like a rope. And then one of them is feels the legs. And he goes, no, brothers, you're both wrong. The elephant is like a great tree trunk. And the other one says, how can you say that? He's holding the trunk. The elephant is like a wiggly snake. And then the other one says, my brothers, how are you all so foolish? Don't you know the elephant is like a great fan? He's holding the ear. And so that's what it's like. And you know, it's a metaphor. How do you know truth? If you just see a little part of it, you don't get the whole big picture. And that's the way it is with the Master's life. I think those direct disciples that have written their subjective accounts, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they give us a glimpse. The inspired biographers and historians who give us a more historical approach, they give us a part of it. And it's our job to put it all together. And if we want to know who these masters really are, then the way we really know them, with the mind, with the heart, but most importantly, we know them in the deep stillness of our own being, where we realize that our own higher self is really who these masters are. The light that shines in them is the light that shines in us. And in Autobiography, I'll just close with this. If you remember, when Yogananda was a little boy, he would go to visit many saints in India. He describes them. And they all called him Chota Mahashaya. And he translates that, Master translates that as little sir. But when we were in India, someone came up to us and said, it doesn't mean little sir. It means little, small, enlightened one. Mahashaya means great soul. So it means child, great soul. But he doesn't put it that way. In his humility, he just says little sir. So that's who we all are. We're Chota Mahashaya, little great soul. We're not quite there yet, but little by little, by looking at the different facets of these great masters, we can start awakening ourselves.
Okay, so now, as Devi said, if anyone has questions for Phil to answer, we're happy to listen.
Thanks for putting me on this spot.
There's a question.
So I'm reading your book on Kindle. Yes, I'll give you a good review. So I was struck in the very beginning when you talk about how Yogananda is really tuned into the miraculous, and that one of the validations of any of the masters is this capacity for doing the miraculous. And yet, in integrating that into the Western world, we're so suspicious of miracles that we kind of disassociate our spiritual walks from miracles and kind of, I think, deplete it. So in your walk, all three of you, in this avenue, to what degree are we depleting these walks by kind of disconnecting from the miraculous when clearly the miraculous was both his calling and his manifestation of his little man? I mean,
In my experience, there are two kinds of people who love the Autobiography of a Yogi. The people who love it because of the miracles, and the people who love it despite the miracles. By which I mean, there are people for whom the miraculous stories, the stories of wonder and the great feats of the yogis he describes, is most appealing. And it's an eye-opener for them and an inspiration. Other people think it's poppycock, or, just his imagination, or, stories told to sort of wake people up, but that aren't necessarily true. But they love the book anyway. They get something else out of it. And that ambivalence is, it seems like ambivalence, but it's not. It's a paradox that the great teachers hold and teach very specifically and with purpose. And Yogananda was one of them. So was Buddha. So were all the great masters. They would talk about the miraculous and the feats of consciousness as illustrations of what consciousness, human consciousness, is capable of when it's fully developed. And the stories have appeal because we love that kind of thing. We love to imagine having those powers, and we like knowing that they're possible. And they're door openers. And then the same teachers will say, but don't pay too much attention to that stuff. That's not what's important. What's important is your inner realization, your inner happiness, your inner peace. And if you get too caught up with the miraculous and aspire to that and aim for that, you're going to lose sight of what's really important. So they would present these and then ground you in what's really important. Yogananda was no different in that regard than some of the many, many teachers who, they'll say, yes, this stuff is possible, but like all the attractions of the world, you can go too far in being attached to them. And so use them. Don't try to cultivate them. If they happen to you, fine, use them for good purpose. If they don't, that's not the whole goal of spirituality. His teacher told him that. He had to be told that by his own guru and others, and he taught the same thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you don't think it's a depletion of the skeptic that they also had to appeal to, or they also had to kind of modify their message because they didn't want to be lost in the, oh, you're just another charlatan kind of mentality.
And he was he was accused of that,
Yeah.
for sure. But then, you know, he taught, the methods he taught, the meditative practices, came to be called energization exercises, all these yogic methods, they had value. So forget about, you know, the great powers of the mind. It made people's lives better. They thought more clearly, they felt more calm inside. That's a miracle. That's miracle enough, isn't it?
Interesting.
I would add to that I think you're being simplistic in dividing the world into believers and skeptics. I think there's a whole spectrum there. And so the real skeptics will get turned off by the miracles. They'll say, it's a charlatan, he's making it up, it isn't possible, throw that book away. But there's a gradation beyond that asks, why should I believe him when everybody's putting out opinions or everybody's putting out teachings? Why should I follow along with this guy? Maybe I should actually follow some business teacher who is showing me how to make $1 million. So how do you know that a person is authentic? And so the true skeptics don't even care whether he's authentic or not. They've already made up their mind that miracles aren't possible, therefore he has to be a fraud. The next group is saying, how do I know that he's not a fraud? And so to that group, talking about miracles opens up the the space for them to listen to the real teaching, which is what Phil was saying. Swami Kriyananda used to say that it was, he most liked to teach in India because you don't have to justify God or yourself. Secondly, he preferred Europe and especially Italy because they had a lot of heart quality. The hardest was speaking in America. He said, I had to spend the first half of the lecture convincing people that I wasn't a fraud. I had to spend the next quarter convincing people that I might know something about what I'm talking about that they don't already know. And I only had a quarter left to give any real teaching. And so it's like that with the autobiography and the miracles. You know, so the miracles convince people that he's not a fraud. And then he's got to unwind that for the real the people who want to go further, because at a certain point miracles become a barrier, not a lure.
They've answered it very well. Why don't we go on? Other questions?
In your writing and research process, did you feel Yogananda guiding you, or did you develop a relationship with him as you immersed yourself in his life?
That's an interesting question. In American Veda, I wrote about all the gurus, and some of them, I may have spent a few days on, others more. And while I was writing about each of them, and about, non-gurus, just influential people, I felt that I was establishing a relationship with them just because I was having to tune into who they were and the circumstances of their lives. This was a few years of digging in and not only reading his own words, but reading about him and putting him in context. I've been on a spiritual path for about 50 years now, and I'm not prone to having spectacular experiences or paying too much attention to the esoteric. But there were times when I really did feel that. And especially times when it wasn't like, I hear Yogananda speaking to me. It wasn't, nothing like that. But there were times, especially when things were difficult, when I was sure I'd never meet my deadline, or I'd never get a handle on this chapter, or how to approach this aspect of his life. And when I was, tired and overwhelmed, there were those moments when I thought, something's guiding this. Maybe it's, the soul of Yogananda. Maybe it's just that I was tuned into, and it sounds pretentious, but tuned into something more important than me and this project and getting it done. But that there was something, divinely inspired about needing to do it. And at those moments, I felt, this is probably my little minor league version of how Yogananda felt when he was facing difficulties and thought, I don't know how I can make this work. I just want to go back to India and be a monk. But he too felt the attunement to whatever is bigger, and maybe his guru's words, maybe the Spirit of God, whatever it was, he persevered, and so I persevered. And those were the moments when I felt some kind of guidance, whether it's Yogananda or not. But I did come to feel like he was my friend. I came to develop some kind of relationship with him in that sense, even though I've never been a disciple.
So I have a question if no one has that. Anyone else have a question? Please. Rahul.
I grew up in Calcutta, and but I'd never heard of Yogananda. I was just curious, as part of your research for the book, are there, in Calcutta, did you get a chance to find out, where he grew up, and are there currently followers of, maybe not him because he left early, but, his gurus and their other disciples? Is there
Oh yeah, there's Jyotish and Devi spoke about their efforts in India. SRF has their, organization in India, and it's very active. I think, in fact, Yogananda's teachings are probably better known in India now than they were when he was alive. Certainly better than when he was alive, because, he only lived 6 more years after Autobiography of a Yogi was published. And the autobiography, you could see it even in those 6 years. It expanded his reach in a significant way. Suddenly he was known in Europe. Suddenly, there were centers, in different parts of the country where they weren't before. There were students, globally, and that was just the beginning. So yes, and there's offshoots. His guru had other disciples as well, and so that lineage has branched off in many directions. And so Kriya Yoga is taught in different forms. Many teachers trace their lineage back to the same guru lineage. So yes, that's certainly the case in India.
It was fun. Last year we went to Calcutta and we went to visit Master's boyhood home at 4 Garpur Road. And our cab driver got lost. So he was circling around, and we were getting farther rather than closer. So one of the people in the car with us said, let's just get out. I know we can walk there, it's easier. So it was really fun. We were many blocks away from the home. And so we were walking, and it's kind of like a little neighborhood. If you grew up in Calcutta, lots of little neighborhoods. And so we were walking through the streets, and there were little children playing and people selling vegetables. And again, this is very subjective, holding the leg of the elephant, not the whole picture. But it was like, wow, I felt like what I was thinking was, wow, Master, I'm in your neighborhood, and I just felt like I could feel him running down the streets playing and yelling to his friends, but his presence is more and more, he's being respected. In fact, the Prime Minister of India, Mahendra Modi, just issued a stamp from the National Indian Government for the 200-year anniversary of YSS. That's the Yoga Satsanga Society that he founded. So it would be 19, or it was last year, so 1917. That's when he founded it.
So the 100-year.
100-year anniversary, yes, thank you. But, and there's in Puri, there's Sri Yukteswar's ashram, Sarampur, Sri Yukteswar's ashram, up in the Himalayas, you can go visit Babaji's cave. So, and the Hari Mahashaya home in Benares. So there's many, many wonderful sites that you can go to visit throughout India. And so it's very, very
I'll add to that. As part of my research, I went to those places. And then I've taken tour groups to India, and we trace the footsteps of all the gurus who came here, but with special emphasis on Yogananda now. In fact, I'm taking one soon as a commercial notice. There are postcards in the back for the next tour. But when you go, not just to the home where he spent his teenage years, where his brother's grandson now lives and allows people to come and see the meditation room Yogananda as a teenager set aside for himself and that sort of thing. But you see the places that he went to visit some of the swamis and the mentors that he had early in his life before he even met Sri Yukteswar. Some of those places are now ashrams and shrines. And if you go up the river, there's a Yogananda ashram along the Ganges, very close to the Kali temple where Sri Ramakrishna held forth, and Yogananda used to go there with one of his mentors and meditate long hours at that temple. And so you can retrace some of the footsteps. Like there's a center in Calcutta near the family home where, on the site where he created an ashram when he was 15 in a little sort of hut. So you can do those things. And imagine that it's 100 years ago, before all the noise and the crowds and the automobiles.
Just to find a little factoid, a couple of years ago, Modi had an International Day of Yoga declared at the United Nations. And he chose as the icon for that day, Yogananda. So that, his reputation is growing and growing, and much more so after the autobiography, but also because India now is so westward looking that Yogananda is especially appealing to the current Indian mind, because he established himself in America and then his teachings are coming back.
And one final thought, which is fun. Ananda has a publishing house in India, and we now have autobiography in Hindi, Bengali, Marathi, so regional languages. Tamil, yeah, that's right, 4 regional languages. So it enables a lot more people to read it as well. Question in the way back. Yes.
If you would each maybe tell a story of something that was new from the book that has meaning for you about Yogananda's life.
I'll let them go first, because
Tell a story about something that was new in the book that was particularly meaningful. I don't know that a single story comes to mind, but an episode of his life, which was when he came first to America in 1920 and landed, and he was in Boston, and he started out living in a YMCA, and then it was about 4 years or 5 years that he was building a little group of people there in New York, in Boston, and he gradually began lecturing a little farther afield, but it was really not until about 1925, I think, that he gave his first lecture in New York, and 24. And so that period of slow building, I guess, resonated with me particularly, or with us, because that's what we've been doing our whole lives. You know, we go into a new beachhead. It might be Europe. It might be India. We establish a little beachhead, and then gradually it builds and builds until it becomes a well-established enough work to touch many, many thousands of lives. So it just to see that Yogananda went through that same process, and here's a great teacher. Maybe it relaxed me a little bit about it. Maybe we're not such failures after we didn't walk into Carnegie Hall on the second day.
I think for me, particularly given the climate of intolerance in our country right now for diversity, reading about when Yogananda went to Miami, Florida to give a talk, was that like 28? First he wrote to his friends that he was very enthusiastic. He really thought it was going to go well. And then there was a very, very redneck sheriff, or I guess head of the police department, who just essentially ran Yogananda out of town on a rail, saying that it was just all sorts of charges. You know, it was a sex cult and, you know, all sorts of things. And this head of the police department, sometime shortly after that, was actually convicted of murder. So he was not a very savory character. But just to, what I felt in reading that was, that was a time, America, one likes to think we have become a more tolerant country, although sometimes one doubts it right now. But nevertheless, he lived through that at that time to just sort of, in a way, maybe bleed off some of the poison that other people of color would experience, and he took it onto himself. And it made me appreciate so much. He didn't have to come here. He could have been happy as a monk, but Phil goes into a lot of detail about that episode. But it just was, wow, the great, you think, well, we can appreciate the martyrdom of many great saints in our Christian religion. But Yogananda was martyred in America as well. And it was, and how did he handle it? He just kept going. He just kept going. He did say that he felt those people would incur very bad karma for treating a man of God that way. But anyway, that story was very powerful in my mind.
He called it his Miami crucifixion.
Yeah.
But I want to add to it. It wasn't just the bad apple of a police chief. The police chief was responding to what the newspapers called irate husbands, because Yogananda was making headway in Miami. He had a lot of students, the majority of whom, like today's yoga classes, were women. And he was not the first Swami to face that kind of thing. The dark-skinned heathen who has mind power could be hypnotizing the innocent American women to have their way with them. This was going on even before he arrived in America. There were hysterical things about the few swamis and yogis who were here for a while. So the racism, the fear, all that stuff entered into it, and he became a victim of it, and eventually was convinced by the lawyers he hired and well-meaning people that it would be a good idea to leave Miami before something really bad happens, and so he did. But it wasn't the only time he faced that sort of thing. And one of the things I enjoyed discovering, joy is not the word, but it was the thrill of discovery, was that the British government was spying on him, essentially. He was the subject of the British Empire. He was traveling on a British passport as a subject of the British Raj in India, and he could have been deported at any time. And they were keeping an eye on him. I had access to internal memos from the British consulate and all that. I went to see him lecture. He seems innocent enough, but he might be on one of these Gandhi people, so keep an eye on him and that sort of thing. And the other aspect of that was, despite the sort of tenuous nature of his being here and the possibility of being sent away as an undesirable, this is during the freedom movement in India as it was getting bigger, and he spoke out. He was outspoken in his support of Gandhi and the freedom movement. And the other thing was, if you look at things he wrote and said throughout his time here, he was outspoken about a lot of current events. He was not a detached yogi in the sense we might imagine, that they see the world as all Maya, and we sort of stay away from the stuff of the newspaper headlines and all that, because that's all it's a distraction from your spiritual life. No, he was pretty engaged. He spoke out about things. He spoke out against the greed and lack of concern for the destitute during the Depression. He spoke out about the greed of the 20s that led to the Depression as well. He spoke out in many ways against racism, against religious bigotry, and all kinds of things. He did not disengage in that way, and there's a lesson just in that about being an engaged yogi, but also that it took a good deal of courage for him, who could have, if he became an agitator, could easily have been sent back to India and the whole thing ended.
The distribution of your book, I really feel like it's going to be a huge bestseller. People are responding on social media in India, all over the world.
That's good to hear.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
In terms of distribution and the amount of books that you have, people in India, around the world have access through Amazon?
In India, because it hasn't been released yet in India.
That's the
maybe
social
they get
media.
on Kindle. And
Yeah, the social media. I have a lot of people that I'm friends with, and this week it's just exploded.
That's
Since
great
your
to hear.
publications, your picture in
Well,
the book on our site.
Maybe Oprah will hear it.
I don't know whether Amazon ships books back and forth, but Amazon, as they call it in India, is extremely active among and growing. So
Yeah.
so a lot of people are ordering just as here. So if they have the books, I don't know whether they do or not.
All right, may I do something blatantly commercial?
Yes.
Okay, because you brought it up. If you find the book of value and you want other people to read it, all of you out there in live streaming land, write something nice on Amazon. I've just learned that really does matter. So please do, and get the book out there more.
Just, kind of like a random question. Just the letter that Forrest Lawn issued about like Yogananda's passing, about his body like being uncorrupted and all that stuff. Did you touch on that, or did you address that in your book at all?
Yes, I comment on that. I try to, there's other controversies around Yogananda's life, especially if you go to the darker corners of the internet. There's all kinds of speculation and stuff, and I had to address all that. Did you all hear the questions about the famous page in the autobiography where the letter from Forrest Lawn talks about the non-corruption of his body some weeks after his death? Here's what I said about it in a nutshell. There have been people who looked into that and found, sort of coroners and forensic experts who say it's not that unusual because he was embalmed and he was placed under glass for a while. So those observations were not that remarkable, and some people have said, well, there was more to the letter than what was printed in the book. I don't know the truth, and I don't care. My bottom line is, if Yogananda's body were disinterred today, 66 years after his death, and found to be pristine, or the opposite, it wouldn't matter. His teaching, his life as a human being in that incarnation wouldn't change. The teachings wouldn't be any less effective one way or the other, and that's what really matters to me. So I think too much is made of that, and too much is made of the counter-argument as well.
It comes back to the question of how far along that skeptic scale are you? Because if you're far enough along, what does it matter? His teachings are what he was really about.
I'll answer. I wanted to say this earlier, but I wanted to have people have more time for questions about miracles. There's a wonderful story from the life of the great Indian master Ramakrishna. Phil mentioned he has the great Dakshineshwar temple in Calcutta, outside of Calcutta. And his most famous disciple was Swami Vivekananda, who came to the West and he's written a number of kind of very influential books about yoga. So as a young man, Vivekananda went to his master Ramakrishna, and he said, "Master, I know you worship God in the form of the goddess Kali, and I know you have visions of her all the time. Will you bless me that I might have a vision of the goddess Kali?" And Ramakrishna kept saying, "You don't need it, you don't need it." But he kept bugging him. And so after a while he said, "All right, tonight your wish shall be granted. Go home and meditate." So in his meditation, he just had this glorious vision of Divine Mother in the form of the goddess Kali. And it was just amazing, everything he wanted to perceive. And then the next morning he went to Ramakrishna, and Ramakrishna said, "So now what do you have?" Meaning, okay, this miracle happened, but if it doesn't change your consciousness, then it's just an event, whether it's super physical or not. So I think once someone said to Yogananda, "Your detractors are saying that you're losing your powers," and he said, "I don't know that I ever had any powers." So that's not what they value. It's the change of consciousness in the people that come to them for help. And in a way, that's the greatest miracle of all, to transform, as they say, the dross of our consciousness, the mud of our consciousness, into the gold of God awareness. I've been at it for a lot of years, and that's a miracle.
There's a story like that in Yogananda's life. In fact, he writes about it in the autobiography, and I sort of told it in a slightly different way in my book. There's a series of events, and then Sri Yukteswar, his guru, touches him a certain way, and he has this incredible vision. he writes about it, and calls it a vision of cosmic consciousness. And it's a spectacular spiritual, sort of event. The kind of thing people read about and say, I want that to happen. He has it, it's done, and Sri Yukteswar says, let's go sweep the balcony floor. And it's a very Zen-like story. Those are the kind of stories you hear about like a lot in the Zen tradition. Chop wood, carry water.
Yeah.
Let's get back. Let's ground this in reality here, or what we call reality.
Right.
Now, see, we're almost completely talking on a certain plane, but the real plane that Yogananda experienced is he ceased to be Yogananda. And so, what miracle is happening to what or whom? Because at the stage of great samadhi, you merge with the infinite. And Yogananda had a statement, I killed Yogananda long ago. No one dwells in this temple now but God. And so he has to play the part of a human being, and he played it beautifully, and it was a wonderful drama. But that's not necessarily where his consciousness is. It's a little like now we're seeing, video games and virtual reality. You may be playing the game in virtual reality or a video game, but that's not who you really are. But the difference is that he was aware of his beyondness, whereas we're still locked into the delusion that what you see is what you get.
And I want to add to that. In tracing his human story as I did, a lot of his descriptions of his own spiritual experience and these higher states of consciousness, which all match up very well with the traditional yogic literature of higher consciousness and enlightenment stages, they came later in his life. He talked in some of his letters home from India in 35 and 36. He describes to private letters his spiritual experiences, and I recount some of them in my book. And they're classic and beautifully written, eloquent descriptions of his consciousness having new kinds of spiritual experiences. So we must not have the impression that the Yogananda later in life had the same state of consciousness as the Yogananda in his 20s and 30s necessarily. He grew spiritually, as we all are. And we may aspire to eventually, have the status, the spiritual status that he attained, and maybe, we won't in this life, but there is growth. There is a process of development, even in the great ones, and you can see that in his life.
There's a question about that.
I've read that Yogananda performed miracles, like we read about in the Bible, healing the sick, raising the dead. Did any of that come up? Because I've never read it anyplace else.
Yeah, there are stories about it, and I didn't hear anything about raising dead, but healing, yes, he clearly seems to have had a great, his consciousness was. He had that power of consciousness that could do a lot of things, even when he was, in his 20s and 30s, or even younger. There were stories about him as a teenager doing some remarkable things, and healing is one of them. But but it's very hard to know, how reliable those stories are and how much of it gets embellished over time. But he spoke about it. In fact, at one point, he said he stopped doing it because people got enamored of it. They wanted the healing and didn't want to go any further spiritually.
I just remembered the frontispiece of Autobiography of a Yogi. Master quotes the Bible saying, lest ye see signs and wonders, you will not believe. And so that may be why he talks about them. But as far as raising the dead, actually in Swami Kriyananda's autobiography, The New Path, he talks about an incident where there was, I believe, he was an insurance salesman. I just remember that part of it. And his wife was critically ill, and he kept asking Master if he would help, heal his wife, And Master had said, I only do what God tells me to do. I have no power on my own. And then finally the man's wife died, and Master said, now God tells me to go. And he did raise her from the dead. So that's in Swami's autobiography, The New Path.
But we can accept that. Phil has to go and find the source and verify that.
Yeah, they're no longer alive.
But there are
No, those are the times when you say, and Swami Kriyananda said.
Right.
I'm off the hook.
No, I don't think it's fair what you, I'm sorry to say this, but I mean, if you've known someone for 50 years and they've always told the truth, I don't doubt that it's.
No, I'm just saying that Phil,
Yeah,
not
Phil.
me.
Right.
No, because we know Swami. He spent years in India, and he met and was with many of the people who knew Yogananda. So he has his own independent source of stories, and we know him to be completely honest. So when he says that story is true, we don't need any more. But Phil writing for the public is what I was referring to.
I was curious where your information for the biography tended to come from, different places.
My sources, you mean?
Yes.
There's his own writing, not just the autobiography, but his disciples were very meticulous about recording everything, all of his speeches, all of his conversations. And he wrote a lot of essays and articles for their in-house magazine, that he started in the 20s and continued. People wrote about him, as we were saying, Swami Kriyananda wrote about him, some of his other direct American disciples wrote about him. His brother, his younger brother, wrote a memoir called Mejda, which is what they called him, about their boyhood together. One of his spiritual companions as a teenager also went on to become a Swami, and they were kind of spiritual colleagues. He wrote about their time together as young men. And there were government documents, there were letters that are unpublished that I managed to get my hands on. There were letters that were published by SRF and others, that put them together. And Yogananda is so, there's so many people enamored of Yogananda that some of them became collectors of Yogananda-bilia, you could say. and some for benign purposes, just because, he was their guru and they wanted to collect everything they could, and others for not benign purposes. They wanted to get the dirt on him and so forth. And I managed to get some private archives as well. So it was a combination of all those things. I interviewed people in India, I interviewed people here. Of course, he's been gone too long to have, interviewed many direct disciples who knew him. And by the time I got around to writing this book, I had met and interviewed Swami Kriyananda, but I wasn't writing this book at that time. But there were one or two that I did. So, you just do whatever you can. And there are little things like, when he returned from India, I just love this story. When he returned from India, he'd been away 16 months, and the last leg of the journey was a ship from the UK to New York. he was delayed in New York for 3 or 4 days. They wouldn't let him back into the country. And this was known because people have seen the records of, the documents that say, here's a list of people on ship, these people were detained, and all this stuff. And there was all kinds of speculation on the internet about why he was detained. And there were, scurrilous things hypothesized. And I didn't know the answer. But I managed to get in touch with the National Archives, and they have an immigration department and all that. And so one of the historians dug into it for me. Because the forms I saw had all these symbols on it, and I didn't know how to decipher the symbols. And it turns out that of all these really dramatic and sensational explanations that had been offered, that people were absolutely convinced were true. Everything from, he was held up because he was considered a radical, Gandhiite, and there was a lawsuit pending, and they wouldn't let him in until. Turns out that there were 2 theories. One, he was traveling under Mukundalal Ghosh, his real name, and Nayaswamis Yogananda, and they needed to straighten out who he was. The main reason the historian said was, if you look at this date and this document, his re-entry visa had expired. And I noticed, yeah, right, there's these letters that say, I'm staying in India longer, I have to renew my re-entry visa in order to do it. And then he decides to stay even longer, and so it expired before he got here. And that was it. But you think about it, if I hadn't done that, maybe one of the other theories would have prevailed. And,
that's great.
Rumors spread, but that's, the nature of reality these days.
I thought you were going to say.
There's your elephant story.
I thought you were going to say he had a piece of fruit that he got on board.
The metal alarm went.
Maybe one last question.
I have a follow-up question to that. Did you research in the National Archives in India sources in Bengali or Hindi? Were you able to find any local sources that you had to translate or anything like that?
I had to get some letters that he wrote in Bengali translated for me. But they were, private letters between him and Bengali friends. But I didn't do much of that in India. I spoke to people in India who were sort of expert in the life of the family, the history of Calcutta, had looked into his early life and that sort of thing. But I didn't go into the Bengali archives or anything like that.
Are those background papers available for the rest of us?
Are what?
Background papers. Compiled all that information so the rest of us can consult them as well?
You're welcome to come look in my file drawers.
So maybe we'll let people buy Phil's book and he can sign it. But I want to just have a final few words that I just think beyond any commercial motivation, I think this book is a great contribution to the world of spiritual understanding. And I think we just all owe Phil a great debt of gratitude for the effort and the wonderful job he's done.
I must add that I greatly appreciate the support that Jyotish and Devi have given me from the start, not only cooperating and give me access to other people in the Ananda world who were very helpful in my research and my outreach, and now in the promotion phase. I value them as friends, and as their support is very meaningful to me. And so I give them, please.
Awesome, very much. Before we have the sign.
The serviceful thou art service, to the serviceful thou art service, to the lover the lover thou art love, to the sorrowful thou art sympathy, to the sorrowful thou art sympathy, to the yogi thou art bliss, to the yogi thou art bliss. O God beautiful, O God beautiful, O God beautiful, O God beautiful, at thy feet, oh, I do bow, at thy feet, oh, I